different after Katrina happened? Do they have like have they organized in a way like if it happens again, to be able to avoid what happened before? Has that issues come up and like have they developed different ways? So if it happens again, what happened? Wouldn't necessarily like so people could get out there safe and to try to avoid, since that's like really the premises of any natural disasters.
You know, the answer I'm going to give you, I mean, yes, there's a huge amount of discussion about this, and the answer I'm going to give you, Lauren, very frankly, is not satisfactory. So there's billions and billions that have been spent supposedly to make us safer for what's called a real Category 3 hurricane. Well, Katrina was not a Category 3, it was worse than that. So because of the, skinflintedness of the Bush administration, they never committed to more than less than what we had. And, we have on tape the interview with the candidate who became President Obama committing to ACORN in a meeting in the lower Ninth Ward before he was endorsed that the first thing he was going to do was come up with the infrastructure money to support the rebuilding of the levees to the full Category 5 hurricane. Now, of course, and the first thing he was going to do is appoint a special czar for the recovery and rebuilding of New Orleans. Well, none of that happened. I mean, we do have the tape, and it's been in a documentary film and whatever. But that and a couple of bucks you can get on a bus in New Orleans now. But that didn't happen. Of course, there are mandatory evacuation plans now anytime there's a hurricane. But then the problem in New Orleans is it's actually expensive for poor people to be evacuated too. So the first time there was a mandatory evacuation, learning a lesson from Katrina, they cleared the city out. And we did get all, pretty much 98%. I mean, everybody got out. They bussed low-income families out, and they took everybody out. And then the mayor wouldn't let people back in, so they ran out of money. So you literally had people, this, Jode family kind of situation where when they finally opened the city up, you'd be driving back and see people in their little hoopty cars who'd gotten out and run out of gas, didn't have hotel money because there was no. When there's a disaster, FEMA pays, gives you money to stay out of town. But when there's not a disaster, when it's essentially a false alarm, you're out of luck like Chuck. You're stuck on a highway in Mobile, whatever. So people were desperate to get back and couldn't afford to get back, and they didn't have any money to get back. And so what the moral of the story is going to be. That next hurricane, where they said you had to evacuate, lower income people without resources aren't going to evacuate.
But isn't that kind of like what happened during Katrina?
I told you the answer was not going to be satisfactory to you, Lauren. I promised you this. So don't give me no fat lip. No. I'm saying this. I mean, I'm an organizer.
Right.
But you deal with reality. If you're not going, if it's an unfunded mandate, if you're going to say you have to evacuate, but you're not going to evacuate people, and one of the lessons has to be that you evacuate people. And that's not what we have a governmental structure and to do. So now what worries me is now we've had a couple of years where we didn't have a hurricane scare, is that as that happens, we're going to be back in the same situation where 50, 60,000 people don't evacuate and just have to hope it misses us. Here's the other thing. So we learned a lot about records, for example. And we had, a number of projects, and we even submitted applications and got some funding from FEMA. None of it was processed after I left. It's a high-tech world. Why not go home to home and scan everybody's records so that they're digitized and you have the property records, the insurance records, the birth certificates, all that, whatever people need, the graduation certificates, so that you've got that all, in a file and people can get to it. But it actually takes money to go door to door with a hand scanner and spend the time and scan it, and so that hadn't really happened. Everybody would still be in the same situation trying to, recover their documents. I mean, it's amazing how little people, you learn a lot, but those lessons are quickly lost, unfortunately.
Yeah. No. This is like I'm from Cuba, Havana. And, like we're constantly.
Absolutely.
I don't live like I live in like a second-story building, but I live like a few blocks away from the sea, so my area gets flooded. And maybe it was the same year as Katrina, or maybe a year before we had a huge flood.
Right.
Especially if a hurricane comes to the north.
Yeah.
And that's a funny thing that here I always find that like people don't want government involved, but in Cuba actually the whole evacuation system works because government is so involved into it, and they actually take care of everyone in the shelters to give them food. There's like this whole setup, and the problem here is like if you don't have the money, it's like everybody's on their own because government can't get involved, and you're depending on these all different organizations to be able to have the funding to do all these things. So
Yeah,
it's just
and
so tricky. It's like,
it's very, it's very frustrating.
and the other thing in Cuba also, sorry, it's like,
No, go ahead.
so your neighbors, like a lot of times they say it's like, oh, if you have your neighbor that can take you in, they take you in, but you know your neighbors. But like if it's a whole neighborhood, that's totally.
Who's going to take you in?
Who's
Right?
going to take you in?
Yeah, and you can't depend on relatives.
Especially in Ninth Ward, it's all houses. There's no buildings there.
Yeah. Well, and there now are less evacuation sites in the city. They're very clear. They're never going to allow the convention center or the Superdome
Right.
to be used for evacuations again. Well, those are huge public buildings. Well, but it took so long to convince the rest of the world and industrial tourism that you could come back to the Superdome, come back to the convention center, and that's a driver in the economy. So those are now not evacuation locations. So, yeah, I just, unfortunately, I think the coordinators of disaster plans, I mean, that's sort of an inbred little industry of the Red Cross and a couple other large nonprofits. And it was amazing because in responding, in trying, when I was still at ACORN, I left, almost 4 years ago. When I was still at ACORN, we looked at all the cities that were threatened where we were organized. We had offices in almost 100 places, and whether it was earthquakes along our California offices, or what was in New York because of that problem, or all of our Florida offices. And so we literally did a campaign going to all of the disaster coordination committees, and almost in each and every case, they didn't want any new membership. They didn't want low-income organizations involved in disaster planning. They still had nothing for a year. The first several years after Katrina, if you looked on the FEMA website about lessons from Katrina, it was blank. It was, sort of not available to the public. So a lot of what we learned was not transparent whatsoever, not something people were willing to change. I mean, not a response thing, whether it was from Red Cross or anybody else. I mean, people learned, Habitat for Humanities and so many other groups learned how to raise money on a disaster, but didn't necessarily learn how to change their model from Katrina. They would say differently, but not in the way you and I are talking about. And the notion of full government participation and full citizen mobilization on a disaster of the nature of what you see in Cuba, unimaginable. There's no culture ready for that.